Hi! So today I want to show you how a parallax system, much like the one that is pre-built into Godot, you can see here the different layers in the background moving at different speeds, can be adjusted a bit to make it a bit more intuitive to use. Personally, I was always kind of annoyed a bit when trying to position separate elements on a parallax layer, like say this house here. It's hard to tell where this house will actually be when the player is over here. Like, yes, from the default position it's here, but it's going to move at a different speed depending on what layer it is. So what I wanted was a preview to show me where would this be in the actual game. So now what I made here, let's see. I have this camera dummy here with a player dummy on it. And this is not gonna do anything in game. If I look here, it's just Q3, it does nothing. But in the editor, it gives me a preview of what my parallax system is up to and what's going to happen with the current settings. And say I want a building right in front of the player when standing at this location. I can take a building, place it here, and there we go. So with all of this, I can pretty much exactly control what I want my parallax layers to look like. So now let's take a look at how to make a system like this. So we're starting out here with an empty scene for the most part. All I have in here is a player. I can just put the player script on here I use in the other one, which really is just some simple input code to let me move in whichever direction. Actually, I need this to be a kinematic body, change type, and a collision shape, though it doesn't really matter, because I'm not actually going to be colliding with anything. This is just, well, for a real player you would want to have this, so I kind of added it as well. But it doesn't matter in our case, I'm not going to be doing collision today. So now if I go into the game, I can move the player character around fine, and that will help with visualizing what's actually happening. Now let's activate the camera 2D, set it to current, and see what we're gonna do here. I will start by creating a node 2D, and this is going to be the parallax root. This is roughly going to be equivalent to the function of a parallax background in the pre-built original version of how Parallax is implemented in Godot. So basically it's a parent for all of the parallax layers. So in this case we would have a parallax layer as a child of this, maybe a couple more of those. And these would pretty much be functional all on their own. They have a few settings here. I'm not going to implement all of these, but I am going to implement the most important one, which is the motion scale. How fast should it move on the x-axis and the y-axis relative to the player's camera specifically. Now we're not going to actually be using these, but our code is going to be quite similar. Let me remove all but one and keep that one around for later. Add another node 2D, call it parallax layer, and essentially this parallax layer is going to be what stores the information about how quick anything that's under here, any child of this, should be scrolling with the movement. So this is going to need a script. Let's attach a script to this. Let's call it custom parallax layer. Give this a class, that way we can check later if an object is of the correct type. So our parallax root isn't going to be trying to move around things that aren't layers at all. Just say class name custom parallax layer, and I'm going to put a 2 at the end, simply because the first one already exists in the project down here, and this way we don't have any collisions in naming. Now this script doesn't actually do all that much. What it's going to do is provide a vector2 variable named motion scale. Now if we look at this, it's going to be looking like this: script variables, motion scale, accessible with the motion underscore scale property. and it has an X and a Y scale. If we look at the original Parallax layer that's part of the engine, it's quite similar, motion scale, also unaccessible via motion_scale, with an X and Y property. I'm ignoring the ones down here, because they aren't used as frequently. If you need them, I'm sure you can expand the stuff to work with those as well. So this is actually all the layer itself is going to do. All of the movement will be controlled by the Parallax root. So let's go into the Parallax root now, attach a script to that, and figure out what we want this to do. Now, as you saw earlier, the movement actually happens in the editor, as well as in-game. In-game, of course, things should be scrolling parallax layer-wise the same as they did with these things, which I'm going to delete now. But they should also be moving in the editor. To make things move in the editor, we add a tool flag up here. This way, the editor knows this should be running both in the editor and in the actual game. We can add some code later to make sure that we can act a bit differently depending on where we're running the code. One thing to be aware of, whenever using tool to modify the position of any nodes in the hierarchy, it's usually a good idea to go on the debug tab here and make sure that synchronize scene changes is off. We don't want to tick here. If this thing is turned on, then anything that is being moved in the editor will then try to also move in game again, and it will kind of sometimes get messy. It can sometimes be hard to properly debug. Just be aware that if you have this enabled, it shouldn't technically break anything, but sometimes things might look wrong if in this particular setup. Right, now what does this thing actually need? First of all, I want the preview mode not to always be enabled. I want to be able to turn it off just in case I want to see how my level geometry looks like without any scaling in Parallax. So for that, let's just add a export type bool var preview mode, and I'm going to give this a setget set preview mode. I don't actually care about the getter part, so I'm only using a setter, because nothing specific actually happens when getting this variable. I will create the setter in a moment, but first let's also create a variable for our target. This is essentially supposed to be the position of our camera, but what I'm going to have is both the player as a target in-game, as well as a dummy version of the player that doesn't appear in-game, as you saw earlier. This way, I can position the dummy anywhere and don't have to worry about putting my player back where he belongs every single time I test something in the game and want to start playing again. This way everything will just stay where it belongs. So now with that done, let's actually create this setter. Set preview mode as written above. It gets some value, which is a Boolean value, but whatever. Let's say preview mode is equal to val, so that's actually set. And let's also make sure that I put a reminder in here. To do update positions. Because there's a thing that's going to be relevant later. Whenever I disable the preview mode, I want everything to go back to its default location. So I don't just want to stop updating things, I also want everything to reset. I'll be doing that here, but in a bit. Now let's go into the ready function, so we can start setting things up. First of all, if the engine.editorHint flag is set, that means the code is currently running in the editor and not in game. In this case, we want our target to be our dummy. I'll just say get node camera dummy. And this node currently doesn't exist yet. I didn't create it here yet, but I will in a moment. Okay, also in any other case, which means we're in game now, I want the target to be the player. So specifically I want it to be the player's camera, since that's the position we are comparing to. So we say ground layer /player /camera 2D, which again, this exact location doesn't exist yet. I will be creating that now. So first of all, let's see, we are going relative to the parallax root. I'm adding a node 2D here, which is the ground layer. That's not in there. It should be. So this ground layer is not getting the script for the custom parallax layer. The reason for that being the ground layer doesn't move. Well, it moves relative to the camera, but it doesn't need to move itself because the camera moves. So yeah, that's why I'm not giving it the script. It doesn't need it. The player is a child of this ground layer, and so is basically anything that's supposed to be on the same layer as the player. So that pretty much creates this. We have the ground layer, we have a player in there, and the player has a camera 2D, which is the point we are accessing right there. Now we need a camera dummy. For this, what I can do is just go into the parallax root, create a position 2D, put it in the same location as the camera for now. There. Okay, now it's in the same position as the camera. Give it a... Actually, don't give it a sprite, I'll just copy this one. There we go. Make sure we can only click the thing itself and not the sprite underneath. And now if I move this around, this position here is what we can use as our dummy. Let's call it that too. Camera dummy, player dummy. The player dummy itself doesn't do anything, it's just there as basically decoration so we can actually see where the player would be, whereas the camera dummy is the one that's relevant for positioning all the objects. Now we have all of this working. Let's continue with actually processing things. Func process. With delta, sure, we don't actually need delta in this case, so I'll put an underscore, that way it won't complain. Process, again, we want to make sure that we cover all cases. First of all, if engine.editor hint and target isn't set. This can happen sometimes, because when we're in the editor and the script here is being edited, then it's not going to call the ready function all the time. So sometimes you end up with things not updating correctly. Just in case, to make that a bit less annoying, I'm adding this line. So I'm just saying target is get node camera dummy once more if we are in the editor and the target wasn't set yet. Disregarding that, the next thing we care about is if preview mode is active. So this mode here, which decides if it should be showing the preview or not. If this is active, or we are playing in-game, because in-game the preview mode doesn't matter. In-game we always want Parallax to be active. So whenever Parallax is supposed to be active, we first will want to know the offset by which the Parallax is moving. So first of all, offset of the camera effectively. So target.global position. The minus is just there to make the steps later a bit simpler. It doesn't matter that much. You could do it without the minus and just flip all the calculations later instead. Then we say update all offsets of this offset. This function doesn't exist yet, but it will. Let's go down here, func update all offsets, which receives the offset as typed above. So what does this actually do? It iterates over all children of our parallax root. So for child in get children, there's a D missing. We first of all want to check if this child is in fact a custom parallax layer, because we don't want to move everything that's ever put into the parallax root, but only the ones that are supposed to be proper layers. So only the ones that have this. I'll copy this, go in here. If child is that thing, execute the code, the following. If not, just don't. We don't care about children that are not parallax layers. Now, for A, I'm just using here 3 variables A, B, C to simplify the layout a bit. So this is vector 2.0. That means that's our starting position. We consider that our starting position is no offset at all, vector 2.0. var B is our offset. So the position that the camera or whatever our target is away from position 0. If we look here, it's the negative of the global position. So it's relative to the global position 0, 0 that we are comparing our offset. Then var c is the child we're looking at, so the parallax layer, dot motion scale, the exported variable we created earlier, right here, whatever values we put in there. And to account for the camera being centered instead of in the upper left corner, you can just say plus vector 2.1, and everything should work out fine later. Yeah, I forgot to type a bit of stuff there. Okay, now what are we actually doing with these variables? We can say child.global position.x is equal to lerp, so linear interpolation a.x, b.x, c.x, where we start, where the endpoint, or basically the value of 1 would be, and how much we want to scale by. This can go beyond the maximum value here, it can be a multiple of that, but this is the percentage we want to scale essentially. Now we want to do the same thing for the y-axis. Lerp a.y, b.y, c.y, done. Now that is pretty much all of the code for this, but we still had this to do here. We can actually finish this now, because now we can say if not preview mode. So if we are setting the preview mode to be disabled, so we're not previewing anymore, then we want to update the offsets again to reset everything. And to reset it, we just set it to the position vector 2.0, the default position. Now that should technically work, but I don't think the script is going to load properly right now. So I'm just going to close this and reopen the scene entirely, because tool scripts do weird things sometimes if you don't reopen the scene once in a while. Now, there's actually currently no way to see what's happening. So let's actually make a few copies of the parallax layer. Let's set these just on the x-axis to 5, 2, 1, whatever. Put a few copies of the necromancer, so we have one on each layer. And then see what happens if it actually works if we move the camera dummy. Just to make sure, is the parallax root? No, the preview mode is turned off. Now it's turned on. Now we can already see they were kind of offset because the position here wasn't at 0. If it were at 0, they would be right there. So now if I move to the right or to the left, these move at different speeds, the same way the default parallax layers in Godot normally do. It's pretty much the same effect. And you can set the exact position of everything. We can say if my character is over there, I want the layer 3 character to sit on his head. And now if I go into the actual game, before I do that, let's attach a script here. Just to make sure that the dummy self-destructs in-game. We don't want this actually doing anything. Or visible. And now I can move around here and find these different necromancers around. And I think this is the one that could stand on my head, though it's kind of hard to see because it's really far out. But the movement is the exact same for this character as well as for the dummy. So we can be sure that if we're at this position, it should look exactly like this. And that's pretty much all there is to this. You can set up the parallax layers however you like, and have a bit more control over what things look like in the end when positioning separate objects. And that way it should be possible to do things like this much more easily, where you place various things like lights or houses or particle effects and anything in your world and still make sure everything is going to be visible exactly where you want it in game. And yeah, this will be all for today. Bye. Oh look, it's an outro thing. So since my last upload, apparently the channel reached 666 subscribers. Pretty impressed. Thanks for that. If anyone has any specific questions or tutorial ideas, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. Yeah. Bye.